All right, good evening. We are getting started tonight, Victory Baptist Church, with our midweek service. And if you missed out, if you're just walking in, you missed the excellent scene. But we're going to get started with the Bible study. We're in Esther, chapter number 8 is where we will start out tonight anyway. We're going to jump around just a little bit. Looking forward to Sunday. Sunday morning, of course, we will be here at 10:30 for our morning service, and we are meeting together again. We will continue to live stream, but we will be meeting together. I've titled this message in this series that I gave it the title of For Such a Time as This, but the title of this specific message is dealing with sin, or the high cost of sin. And I think that's one of those areas that sometimes we as believers, when we're saved, we're excited, we know our sin's forgiven, but sometimes we can forget there is that sin that can come into our lives, and if we don't deal with it, if we don't continue to go to God and deal with it, relying on His help, we end up facing a high cost. And we're going to look at that tonight, looking at this principle from Esther. In chapter 8, verse 1 through 3, let's kind of review. As we've been going through Esther, last week we looked at how Haman was hung on the gallows he had built for Mordecai, as God had been working in the background and protecting his people. And so, at that point, you almost think, okay, everything's good. But there's still a lot that has to be dealt with. In verse number 1, it says, "On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews." Now, I debated when we first started in Esther, I debated going a little bit into detail of who, according to Jewish tradition, but also based on his name here, who Haman is. And I held off, and I think now's a good time to look at this, because what we can find from Haman is the fact that there was sin that hadn't been dealt with. Obviously, you have the sin of Haman, where he has set up for all the Jewish people in the whole empire of Persia to be killed. You got that sin. We know that, and that still has to be dealt with. But generations earlier, somebody else committed a sin that led to Haman and this particular sin. And we can find that in 1 Samuel, chapter number 15. We'll start in verse number 1. It says, "Samuel also said unto Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 footmen, 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and laid wait in the valley. And Saul said unto the Kenites, Go, depart, get you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for ye showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen, of the fatlings and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. You notice it says Agag the king. Agag is actually a title, much like how in Exodus and even in Genesis, where it talks about the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is the title. Agag is the title for the king of the Amalekites. Haman, the Agagite. In other words, he was a descendant of the kings of the Amalekites. That's Jewish tradition, and just how that word is there in our Bible, it makes sense. So, because Saul and the people refused to kill all the Amalekites like they were supposed to, at least one's over here now put in second in command of Persia and has made arrangements for the Jewish nation to be killed. Okay? So they're having to deal with sin that Saul didn't deal with, or because of Saul's sin. But it goes back even further than that. Go to Exodus chapter number 17. Exodus 17, verse number 8. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel and Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men, and go out, fight with Amalek tomorrow. I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi, for he said, Because the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, for the full story, basically Amalek, the Amalekites, had been attacking Israel as they were wandering in the desert, as they were making their way from Egypt to the promised land. The Amalekites would come along and start taking off some of the people in the back. They would come keep doing these sneak attacks until Joshua came and went to battle with them. Now, we're going to get back into this story that we just read in just a moment. But the question might be, well, who are the Amalekites? They're actually, Amalek is the grandson of Esau. He's the grandson of Esau. In the Bible, and you'll recall Esau, Esau was one, he always desired to please the flesh. Remember, he sold his birthright for a bowl of beans. It was always what was immediately in front of him is what he wanted. And so it seems his grandson was the same way. And throughout Scripture, the Amalekites are used as a picture of the flesh. And really, as Christians, what we have to deal with is battling our flesh. And so you have Saul being told to take care of them. You have Moses and Joshua dealing with them in Exodus. And in Exodus, you'll notice that Aaron and Hur had to come and help hold up Moses' arms. I think it's a good picture. Sometimes as we are in our spiritual battles, sometimes we need somebody to come along and help us out. Somebody else to come along and walk with us and maybe hold up those arms or whatever is needed to help. We're going to go back to Esther. Because what ends up happening in Esther, they're still battling the flesh here. Esther is the queen. Esther's, you would think, is in a safe place. Mordecai has been made second in command. You would think he's in a safe place. But they recognize the law has already been signed. The law has the orders to kill the Jewish people has gone out. And Persia had the law that a lot of other nations had as well. Once the law had been written and signed by the king, you couldn't just change it. You couldn't just take it off the books. It was there. Literally carved in stone. Think about that. I mean, it's there for everyone to see. He cannot just take it off. And so it has to be dealt with. Now, the thing that they can do is they can amend. They can't take it away, but they can add an amendment to it. And that's what happens here. And the amendment is not a comfortable thing. Verse number 4. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. Then were the king's scribes called at the time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews and to the lieutenants and the deputies and rulers of the provinces, which are from India unto Ethiopia, and 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post, on horseback, and riders, on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews, which were in every city, to gather themselves together, to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey, upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that the Jews should be ready against the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So what he has done is he has given the Jewish people the right, the responsibility to defend themselves from all those who were going to try to kill them. We need to look at sin in our own personal lives as something that can destroy us. But not only that, not only can it destroy us, it is possible the decisions we make today the sin, the going against whatever God would have for us, may have an effect on our children, on our grandchildren. As far down, we don't know. You think about Esau, way back when, he never dealt with his flesh. His grandson Amalek had the same problem. And all the people over time that had an effect on, because the sin wasn't dealt with, because of Saul not dealing with the Amalekites when he was commanded by God to, and he thought he knew best. Here it's affecting the people in Persia later on. And so we need to recognize the seriousness of anything that goes against the direction God would have for us. Hebrews chapter 12, verse number 1. Probably some of us could quote it, but I want to make sure I say it correctly. Hebrews chapter 12, verse number 1. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Every single one of us have a race, figuratively. But within our Christian life, we have a race course that is set for us. It's not, my race course isn't the same as anyone else's in here. Because God has a course specific for each one of us. Oh, there's some commonalities. There's going to be some places where the courses will be running together. But we cannot compare our courses to everyone else. We need to take time with God and allow Him to show us the course He has for us. And when we sin, when we step off that race, or we allow some sin to slow us down on that course. That's how it says here, the way it's worded. The sin which doth so easily beset us. There's times we can be doing everything just right, and suddenly something's right there in front of us. Or suddenly we say or do something, and it's like, where did that come from? Because we have that flesh still a part of us. And sometimes it starts to get control. And so we have to lay that aside. In that moment, God, I'm sorry, I just said or did, or I stepped off the course for a moment. I got my eyes off you. Ask God to forgive us and ask Him to help us get back. Because getting off that course just a little bit can eventually get us miles away from where we're supposed to be. In fact, it tells us how to stay on our course. In verse 2 of Hebrews chapter 12, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. We look to Jesus, and we have to keep our focus on Jesus as we continue running that race that He has set before us. Now, oftentimes, to lay aside that sin that doth easily beset us, it can seem rather destructive. In chapter 9 of Esther, verse number 1, we read, Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, and the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. And no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. All the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and the officers of the kings helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. In verse number 13, it says, Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan. But on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 70 and 5,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. That's a lot of death and destruction. Something that's not a pretty thought. We don't like talking about death and destruction, but I think it's a good picture of what our sin can do, what our sin can lead to. That's why it is so important. Not only could it eventually cause the death of other people, but it causes, obviously, a spiritual problem within us that we ought not to just be okay with. When something is causing destruction within our relationship with God. I'm not saying we lose our salvation, but that fellowship can be damaged. There again, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, one of my favorite verses because it's so short, but it's a good reminder, quench not the spirit. When we allow those little sins in our life, we end up quenching the Holy Spirit working in our life, and then we do not have that communication and that direction and that guidance that we need. So we need to recognize the consequences of sin does bring destruction. Whether it be physical death or whether it simply be that spiritual relationship is damaged and hindered. So we need to go back, and you don't need to turn there, but going back in our minds to Hebrews chapter number 12, we're supposed to keep our eyes focused on Christ. In other words, when he points out something in our life, hey, that's not for you. And it may be beyond the 10 Commandments. Okay, I think we'd all agree, okay, yeah, we've got to follow that. But there are some things that God points out, hey, that's not for you. For you to be involved in that would be a sin. We need to listen to him, not look at what everyone else is doing. Because there are some things that somebody else may find, oh, that's not a sin for me. You say, well, is that a gray area? No, it's just the case that God knows that if I were to do that, it will lead to something else. And then lead to something else, where eventually I'm in sin, that the other person wouldn't be involved in that sin. We also sometimes, God, it's not always a negative, don't do this. Sometimes it's a case of, I would like you to do this. I desire for you to go in this direction. I would desire for you to do this. But I don't want to do that. If we don't do what God's directing us to do, we're obviously off the course that he has set for us. If we're not running the course that he set for us, that means we are saying to God, you don't know what's best. Now, I don't think anyone in here, if God were to walk in here and we could see his face today, I don't think a single one of us would say, God, you don't know what you're talking about. But when we refuse to do the things that he's directing us to do, that is what we are doing. And I think we would all say saying that to God would be a sin. And so we have got to be very careful, and we've got to stay focused. We need to take time with God daily. And those times, there's those questionable things. We need to take time and ask God for wisdom. I'll just share this. There's a deal I'm dealing with right now. I'm asking God for some wisdom on a minor repair at my house. Not a big deal. But asking God, what's the right way to deal with the repair? There is an easy way that seems to make the most sense, but I'm not convinced that that's the right way. And so you say, well, what's that? I want to do it right. I want to be obedient. And so even in those simple things, if we go to God and ask him, we can let him show us, and that way we know we're doing the right thing. In the end, as we can see in what happens with Esther, Mordecai, and the Jews, there's peace and there's a celebration. In verse number 17 of Esther 9, it says, on the 13th day of the month, Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day of sending portions one to another. They celebrated the victory that God gave them. In our Christian life, I think there again, sometimes we need believers, other believers, to come alongside and hold up our arms or help us in our battle with the flesh and with sin. But also, I think it's just as important to sometimes share a praise. Hey, I was struggling in an area. God helped me. God gave me direction on the course I was to run. God helped protect me in this situation that I was struggling with. But I'm going to tell you this, that in the end, ultimately, there is peace with God when we're doing things right. There will come a time where there will be a great celebration. Turn to Revelation. Revelation 17. Revelation chapter 19. Can't read my own handwriting. Revelation 19, verse number 7. Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him being Jesus Christ. For the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife hath made herself ready. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of saints. And he saith unto me, right, blessed are they that are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he saith unto me, these are the true sayings of God. Now, if we're a believer, we will be at that marriage supper of the Lamb. Every single one of us, if we're saved. But I also think, at funerals of believers, and sometimes funerals of unbelievers, you hear people saying about how wonderful this person was. And they may have been, they may not have been. But I've heard it said many times, well, he was a Christian. He's going to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant. I hope so. But can I tell you, if we are not doing things right, we might be following the letter of the law. Not committing adultery. I haven't murdered anyone. I don't tell. I'm known for being honest, and we can go through. And for the most, I mean, as far as what everyone else sees, we look pretty good. But God knows the heart. He knows those secret sins. He knows, hey, I wanted you to run this course and you went over off this way. And you didn't do what I wanted you to do. And maybe to everyone else, everything looks great. Yeah, we're on our way to heaven. But the thing that I would fear the most is getting to heaven and being told, I wanted you to do this. I had so much more planned for you. But you got your focus off me. You focused on your own flesh, your own desires, and you did not do what I wanted you to do. Think about this. If we don't do what God would have us to do, there may be other people who do not hear the gospel because we weren't there to share it with them, where we were supposed to be to share it with them. You see, the sin that so easily besets us can destroy other people. The sin in the flesh, it can cause such issues and problems. We have to recognize the high cost of sin. Be willing to get our focus on Christ, the author and finisher. Focus on him. He was obedient all the way to the cross, knowing that that was the plan. We need to be obedient with him every step of the course he has for us. Any questions or comments? All right. We're going to go ahead and go to our prayer time. I'm going to pause the live stream or stop the live stream. I will say this, if anyone's watching the live stream, if you have any prayer requests that you'd like us to be praying for, you can email them to me. My email address is klconnor, that's KLCONNOR 1860@gmail.com. And we as a church would be more than happy to pray for those things. If it is something you want to keep private, just between me and you and God, just let me know in that email. But we will be online again this Sunday at 10:30.